Let's look at some names that correspond to specific regions in the human body. Now, this might look pretty exhaustive. There's a lot of terms that describe regions of the body. At some point throughout A&P 1 and 2, we will have mentioned and used a lot of these words. You don't necessarily have to go home and study and memorize all these words, but I do want to point out some of the ones that we use quite a bit. But again, we're going to be getting to these words here and there throughout the semester. This is a good introduction to some of these regional terms. To begin, let's look at the word cephalic. Cephalic means pertaining to the head. It's not used all the time, but we'll be using it occasionally to reference the head. Notice that there's a lot of other terms that correspond to regions of the head, whether it's frontal, temporal, buccal refers to the cheeks, nasal, oral, mental refers to the chin. Many of these are pretty straightforward. A couple of them you may never heard of before, like mental pertaining to the chin. We're not going to use it all that often. Another very important term we do use quite a bit is cervical. Cervical means the neck. A good example would be when we're studying vertebral bones, bones of the vertebral column. The 7 that are located in your neck are called cervical vertebrae. So that term will be used pretty soon. The armpit is referred to as the axilla or the axillary region. The upper part of your arm is brachial. So the upper part of your arm from shoulder to elbow is called the brachium. So pertaining to that part of the arm is brachial. You may have heard of the brachial artery. That's the artery in that part of the arm that we use to take blood pressure. Antecubital is the front of the elbow. There's some important veins that we draw blood from there. Antebrachial is the forearm, kind of the anterior portion of your forearm. Carpal means wrist. There are 8 carpal bones in each wrist. Some other ones we'll mention quite a bit. Inguinal refers to the groin area. How about popliteal? That's one you may never have heard of. Popliteal refers to the region behind the knee. So behind there, there's kind of an area where arteries and veins and nerves run. And that's the popliteal region. But look this over. Another one, plantar, is the bottom of your foot. You may have heard of plantar fasciitis, which is a common ailment for certain athletes. But you can look these over. Again, I'm not going to quiz you on these right away, but I want you to be familiar with this idea that areas of the body are given specific regional terms. Planes are used all the time. If we're going to study the human body or study an organ in the body like the brain, quite often we have to know what it looks like on the inside. And to do that, we need to produce these planes through the body or through the organ. Now, one way to do this is dissection. As you can imagine, this brain has been taken out of a human and dissected. The problem with that is the human has to be dead. What do we do if we want to look at the inside of the brain in a living human? Well, we use MRIs and CAT scans. So if you're going into the field of radiology, or if you're going to be a nurse and you're going to be looking at x-rays or looking at MRIs, understanding what a plane is will definitely help you identify parts of that organ. It's also very important when we're studying organs in this class. We often study the brain in a number of different views. So if we're studying a brain, for example, in this picture here, we need to know what was done to that brain. It was a mid-sagittal section. So some of the terms to describe these planes include sagittal. Sagittal is a vertical line or vertical plane that divides an organ or the whole body into a right and left section. If you do it right down the middle, we call that a mid-sagittal. So if you cut the brain or the whole body right down the middle, each section is going to be equal. So on this drawing, it's this vertical line right down the middle is a mid-sagittal plane. If we're off to one of the sides and therefore produce an unequal right and left, we call that parasagittal. So maybe we want to look at the kidney. And if we did a mid-sagittal, you would not see the kidney because the kidneys do not lie along the midline of the body. So we might want to do a parasagittal plane to be able to see that kidney. Other planes include frontal, also known as coronal plane. That's also a vertical plane, but it divides the body or organ into an anterior and a posterior section. So on this drawing, it's this one here. Again, it's a vertical plane, but we've sliced through this human body and produced an anterior posterior. If we do a brain in that method, this would be a frontal section. Next one, transverse, is the horizontal plane. So that's shown here in green, or panel C is a transverse section of the brain. Again, different view. You might learn different things based on these different views. But a transverse plane will divide an organ or the whole body into an upper or superior section and a lower inferior section. There's a fourth one called oblique. We don't use it very often. We will use the word, and that oblique means on an angle. Next thing, knowing your cavities. This is one slide I'm not going to spend much time on because I'm going to make it up to you to look at these drawings, study these cavities, so know each of these cavity names, and given an organ, can you tell me what cavity it is inside? So real quick, you've got in yellow, this entire yellow area is made up of the cranial cavity and the vertebral canal. Cranial cavity houses your brain, obviously. Vertebral canal contains your spinal cord. Thoracic cavity you want to spend a little more time because it has subcavities. The entire chest cavity is your thoracic cavity. Each lung is inside its own pleural cavity. The heart is inside the pericardial cavity. You can see that here. And then the area in between the lungs is called the mediastinum. That might be one you've never heard of. The mediastinum is defined by being in between the two lungs, above the diaphragm, and below the neck. Inside the mediastinum, you actually have the pericardial cavity inside of it, so your heart would be in there. You also have airways that go to your lungs, so part of the trachea and these larger airways leading to the lungs. You also have the esophagus is in there leading down towards the stomach, and you have several large blood vessels that bring blood into and out of the heart. And then finally you go below the diaphragm, shaded here in green. That is collectively known as the abdominal pelvic cavity, which can then be divided into the abdominal and pelvic cavity. And we do that by an imaginary line. There's basically a line drawn from the top of this little bone called the sacrum to the hip, and that defines the upper part of the pelvic cavity. Next step is to divide that large cavity, the abdominal pelvic cavity, into 9 regions or 4 quadrants. I typically use quadrants more often. I think it's easier for us. It divides this cavity into 4 instead of 9. The names are very easy to remember: upper and lower, right versus left. So right upper quadrant, left upper quadrant, right lower quadrant, and left lower quadrant. The 9 regions, you should be familiar with these 9 regions, that there is such a thing as 9 regions, but I'm going to hold you to the quadrants. So what I mean by that is if I give you the name of an organ, gallbladder, appendix, small intestines, liver, stomach, spleen, can you tell me what quadrant or quadrants can it be located in? For example, the small intestines are in all 4. But the appendix, that's only in the right lower quadrant. So I'm going to leave it up to you to look at these regions and quadrants, focus a little more of your effort on the quadrants, and be able to identify organs in their cavities. And if the organ is in the abdominal pelvic cavity, find what quadrant or quadrants it's located in. So that concludes the set of lectures on this first topic that introduces us to the human body.